When you talk in an energy conference like this, you can rest assured that most of you are big supporters of renewable energy, and that you look at people who work in fossil fuels, especially things like non-conventional oil and heavy oil. The name itself, gives you shivers. Are just people you don't really want to listen to. So I'm here to say that despite of all of this, I'm actually one of the most environmentally friendly people on campus because I work in this area, and I'd like to convince you a little bit of that today. It is all to do with how do we, in a smarter way and more sustainable way, if that's at all possible, produce non-conventional oil. And one of the reasons why I work in this is because I think it's inevitable that we'll do this. And I will show you a couple of numbers to convince you of that, maybe. You can be an incredible idealist and optimist and say, we don't need this. We can do this with renewable energy. But really, the energy policies for the next decade or two have already been decided. It's very hard to shift these things. We are producing non-conventional oil, and there's more non-conventional oil to be explored and produced, and I think that will happen. So then the idea is, well, okay, if that happens, how can we do it in a way that is just a little bit better? So mitigate environmental impacts of these resources, and that's really where I come in. So yes, in this research, I've joined the big bad wolf, but I'm trying to tame him. Now, I'm not saying that I can at all, but I hope to make a contribution. I am very motivated by this question, which really has been the question that you focused on this whole week, right? So I have that too. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that I find this energy question so challenging because energy demands per capita are constantly growing, globally. So when we think about sustainably providing the world with energy, we cannot look at numbers for today, but we have this incredible challenge to increase the amount of energy that we are supplying by quite large percentages. Some people say up to 50% before 2050 we have to produce more. And so it's not just can we provide what we need now in sustainable ways? Can we provide what we will need in the future in a sustainable way? And that's, of course, an extremely daunting question. So anyway, what is happening in oil? Just a little bit of an oil primer. And don't worry about this Norway thing here. This is not related to anything. It's just because I didn't really have enough time to change those slides today. And this was taken from a presentation that I gave to the Norwegian group. So just ignore this unless you're Norwegian and you'd like to feel really good about what you're doing in Norway. One of the things that's interesting, Norway uses 40% of hydro for their energy. 98% of their electricity production comes from hydro. So they're an incredibly nice country to look at. They're also very rich and have a lot of oil and gas. So anyway, they're very enviable, so let's just ignore them and focus on us. So here is the US and the world, not really in the right ratio, these pie charts. The world uses about 450 exajoules per year, and the US about 100. And of course, if you look at the number of people in the US, that just shows you how much we consume per capita, right, in the US compared to the rest of the world. But I like thinking about this in terms of exajoule, because if the US uses 100 exajoule per year, then 1 exajoule is easy to remember, it's just 1% of US consumption. So that's a nice unit to think about. An exajoule, who cares how many joules that is? It's 1% of what we consume. Okay? So that puts everything directly in perspective. And you can see for the US that we are extremely heavily fossil fuel based. You've probably seen those numbers, but you've been trying to ignore it. You've been trying to focus on these little wedges here. Right? And we're going to now look at this beautiful blue wedge right here in oil and the green wedge in gas. Okay? So we are very heavily dependent on oil. So that's message number one. The other thing is that we are extremely dependent on oil and gas, but we don't really have enough to supply our own needs. You know, we're very greedy, we're not very efficient, and we're not producing as much anymore as we used to do. We can debate this, you know, why this is. There's probably lots of factors that play a role, but the fact is we don't produce as much as in the 70s. And as a result, you know, with the consumption growing, our net imports have been growing. Now you see there's a little dip just the last couple of years because of the recession. That's good, but it is going up again. So this is not a downward trend of net imports that soon, you know, will be lower than production. I don't think that will happen. So there's an incredible amount of oil that we're importing. Where do we get this from? Well, all sorts of different places. OPEC countries, of course, you've heard of. But really, the top exporters to the US are Canada, so our neighboring country. We get more than 20% of our imports now from Canada. Mexico is also very large. It varies between 12 and 15% of our total imports coming from Mexico, so maybe you didn't quite realize that. And then we have Venezuela, very friendly country. We have Nigeria. One of the reasons why you read so much about Nigeria in the papers, have you ever wondered about this? Africa is a very big country. Why is it that Nigeria is in the news so much? Well, we get more than 10% of our oil imports from Nigeria. So it's a strategically important country for us. Okay? And then Saudi Arabia is also a country that gives us about 10 to 12% of our imports. Okay? But very large chunks from Canada and Mexico. To put this in barrels, because it's always nice to think about big numbers, so Canada exports about 2 million barrels of oil to us per day. Okay? So that's a lot of barrels. And with $100 a barrel, say, give or take, you can understand perhaps why Canada thinks this is a pretty good deal. Okay? What other export will give you $200 million per day going into your piggy bank, right? It actually turned out when it was in Norway that Norway gives us around 40 to 50,000 barrels a day. So that's an interesting little thing to think about. So top producers in the world, Russia is one of the real top producers. They actually keep on improving their ranking. A couple of years ago they were not producing as much, but they keep on increasing their volume. Saudi Arabia is still the US, even though our production has gone down. And we only hear in the papers that we don't have enough oil and so on. We're still a really big producer in the world. You know, sometimes we forget this. You know, we think that Saudi Arabia and other countries are the big producers, but we're still in the top 5. Okay? And then Iran also. All right, so what is happening here? So we have this situation where our consumption, say, overall is continuing to increase. The demands are higher, the production is continuing to decline somewhat, at least of the existing reservoirs in existing traditional ways. What is the industry doing? No, there's a fantastic market, right, for oil in the world. There is a tremendous pressure on the world oil market as well. So I just talked a bit about the big producers, but when you think about how much capacity there is in the world, we produce about 85 million barrels of oil per day worldwide. You know, a lot of that is being transported around the world to various countries. Is there excess capacity? Well, in the 80s and a little bit later in the early 90s, we did have excess capacity, but that's gradually dwindling. So what this really means is that this oil market is a market under a lot of pressure. Okay? So there's a lot of people wanting this, and of course 2 of the countries that are putting increasing pressure on the world oil market, and there's no surprise that China and India, because they're growing very fast economically, especially China. And so there is not really that much excess capacity, so people can say, well, we have an existing reservoir, we just drilled some more wells, and we'll be okay in meeting this new demand. We are really forced, because of the demand, to look at new, innovative, different ways of getting more oil out. So there's a couple of things that you can do as oil industry. You can say, okay, I look at my existing reservoirs and I try to squeeze more oil or gas out of these reservoirs. And that's enhanced oil recovery. That's one of the areas in which I work. And this is environmentally reasonably friendly because you're saying, let's make use of the reservoirs we have as much as we can. Okay? It's of course wasteful to leave a reservoir and go drill somewhere else. For example, in areas where you really don't want drilling activities, much better to squeeze as much out of existing reservoirs. The other thing you can do is move into hostile environments, and we'll see so much of this. I tell you, in the next 10 years or so, you will hear much more of this. In the Arctic, incredible movement to explore and then later produce in the Arctic, with a lot of discussions and debates already between countries that have interest there. As the ice is melting and the Arctic regions become more accessible, there will be an incredible push there. And I just hope that it stays all relatively friendly. And then, of course, we can explore and produce non-conventional oils in areas that are maybe a little bit easier to access. So let's think about this. One of the things that people talk about a lot right now is shale gas. You heard of this in the news? A lot of people now are advocating this and saying this is what we should be going towards, and there are some good legitimate reasons for this, in the sense that, hey, if we could replace all coal by gas, and gas has a third to half of the CO2 emissions of coal, then of course we would be improving our total emissions, right? We'd be reducing it a lot. People say we have a lot of it, so it doesn't exhaust as quickly, but deplete as quickly as other resources. And they say it's easy to get to. I'm not quite sure if that's the case, but there's lots of debates about this right now. It's certainly true that the beginning reservoirs that they used, and there's a couple out here, the Barnett and the Haynesville, were relatively easy to produce, and that made people extremely optimistic about other reservoirs that were discovered. So anyway, the shale gas industry right now is booming. There's a lot of controversy, especially about the development of the Marcellus right now in the east, the northeast area, because shale gas, as the name suggests, sits in shale. And have you ever looked at shale? I mean, it's a very, very dense rock, and pores are very small. You cannot really produce from this by trying to suck the gas out of these very tiny pores. You need to make it easier for the gas to go through the rock. And one of the ways to do this is to fracture the rock, to break it up a little bit, so that the gas can go into those fractures, and these are then pathways for production. It makes it very easy for the gas to flow out. So you need to fracture this. Now we know how to fracture, because we've been doing this in the oil and gas industry for many years, but there are all sorts of implications, potential implications for the environment, and people are really worried about this. But it's growing very, very fast. In 2007, for example, there were more than 4,000 new wells drilled just that year. Okay, so this is an incredible boom, and this just continuing. It was a little bit less in 2009 and 2010 because of the economic recession, but a lot of people are investing in it. Okay, but this is not the only thing. There's another non-conventional oil that we would have. And the estimates vary a little bit on how much we have, but some people think we have enough for 100 to 200 years of our consumption. So that would be an incredible reserve. Now, right now, up to this point in the history of the world, as the world together, total population, since 18-something, when oil was first started to be used, we've used about 1 trillion barrels of oil. Okay, so that puts that a little bit in perspective. Some people think that shale oil, so oil that sits in shale reservoirs in the United States alone, will have 1 to 2 trillion barrels of oil. So that's an incredible amount of oil. You can also put this in perspective with how many barrels of oil we use in the United States. We use about 7 billion barrels per year, so this would be about 140 years. Now, shale oil, again, though, to produce it, you need to try to get this oil out. The oil is often very sticky. It's a bit like peanut butter squeezed in very, very small pore spaces. How do you get that out? Well, you can try to maybe heat it up, thermal stimulation. So this is an area that I work on as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the time to get heat in the reservoir, you need to create this heat. And how do you create heat? Maybe burn some gas. Right? So they do this also with the tar sands. And so that could have environmental repercussions. You could also maybe try to produce this heat in situ, in the reservoir itself, by using the oil as fuel. So then you don't create steam at the surface by burning gas, but you ignite, if you like. It doesn't explode, you don't need to worry about that because it's contained in those pores. But you ignite the oil inside the reservoir and then locally create steam, because a reservoir doesn't just contain oil, it also contains water. So when you put heat in, the steam will form, and then it will be just like a steam drive. The steam will give its latent heat to cold oil, the oil will heat up, and it will be easier to pull out, pump out in the wells, right, in production wells. One of the big problems with this is that the focal areas of shale oil are in the Rockies, and the big area there is Green River Basin, and many people are worried about mining of this. Sometimes it will take the form of mining, which of course would have tremendously large environmental impacts, and we're hoping that if this gets unlocked, and I think it's likely with the current way that the US is going, with conquest and so on, if this gets unlocked, the best thing to do would be in situ combustion, as I just explained, and this is one of the focal area in my research group. If we can make this work and convince the industry that this is a good way to go, then we would have made a contribution there. The other non-conventional oil resource is the tar sands, right? And you may have seen spreads in National Geographic or other magazines about the tar sands. I visited there about 2 years ago and took some of these photos. There are estimated trillions of barrels in Canada. A lot of the tar sands is now this type of mining, where you're looking inside a huge open mine at the surface of the oil. The oil just sits so many meters below the surface there. It's very young oil in that sense. It sits very, very close below the surface. And it's scooped out in these huge things. This is a person right here. This is, the head is sort of half of my finger there. Okay? So these are huge trucks. They scoop this mixture of sand and oil in these trucks that is then heated up by pouring hot water over it very simplistically, and then gets the oil out, and then the sand is dumped back in. If you've ever been to Wyoming or other places where they do open coal mining, mountaintop coal mining, it just looks as bad. It doesn't look worse, it looks as bad. Okay, so it's not such a good thing, and it's getting a lot of attention, but the people that buy this stuff is us. This comes to us. Okay. So if we wanted to do something about this, we should probably reduce our demand. At the moment, there's many NGOs that try to stop this production by saying we should not import it. I think it's a little naive, and I'm just saying this, maybe get some discussion going, to think that if we don't buy it, nobody will. Right? I mean, the oil market is under a lot of pressure. This is a global oil market. Alberta, of course, will keep producing this and sell it to somebody else who would like it. But there are other ways to do this. There's a new process called steam-assisted gravity drainage that's very clean. Look at this beautiful clean picture that I took there in the morning. You see there's nothing dirty going on here, right? It looks wonderful. And there's another research group here on campus that is working on this area. Okay? So to give you some examples of what we're doing for this non-conventional oil. Anyway, I'd like to stop here. I can talk about this for hours. But what I prefer to do is just get some questions from you for the 10 minutes we have left. I did not bring a student, not because they're really shy or but they're all interning. They're all away and making money. I'm afraid to say. So you have to do it just me. But feel free to ask me any question about oil or other things, about my students. I'll open it up. Yeah.
You mentioned that the thermal simulation of oil shales was less environmentally malignant than the mining. I was wondering what the surface expressions of thermal simulation would be. Would there be thermal expansion? Would there be geysering or anything like that?
Okay. I don't know. Did you all hear his question? So I made a statement to say that, hey, if we could do the shale oil, for example, in situ with thermal simulation, then that would be better for the environment than having open mountaintop mining. And so he's asking, what are the surface signatures of a thermal simulation project? they're relatively minor, but you have to always be very careful here because of course there are environmental impacts. Now it's the same with this versus this open tar sand mining. And you have to create roads, you have to have access to wellheads. Again, you have wellheads everywhere where you start to inject either, in this case, steam directly, so environmental impacts for steam-assisted gravity drainage, a little bit bigger perhaps again, because you have to create that steam. But you always have access, and so no matter what, you will be traversing wild space in the case of the rocky shale oil. If I had a choice, if this was absolutely impossible to stop, and I had a choice, I wouldn't think twice about choosing this over this open mining, for all sorts of reasons. The question really is if there is a choice right now, and this is one thing that I forgot to mention, but it's an interesting thing for you to think about. Very often we have this argument, well, an increase in oil price is a really good thing for us because it makes renewable energy more competitive, and of course that's true. But the other thing it does, it makes non-conventional oil production like this economically feasible. So if the oil price is consistently at $100 a barrel or $125 a barrel, these sort of things are economically feasible. Right now, they're a little bit expensive. In fact, when the oil price went down to about $17 a barrel, the people in Alberta got a bit nervous. They never tell us how much it costs per barrel, but from that nervousness, you can sort of deduce that, well, maybe it costs $70, $75 a barrel. Above that, this is great for them. Below that, it may be a little risky. Okay? So sustained high oil prices have two sides to them, right? On the one hand, they stimulate renewable energy. On the other hand, they also help unlock established resources.
So in the discussion of shale gas this week, people have raised a lot of issues with in terms of water and what's happened there. Another issue that I've kind of been thinking about but hasn't really had much light in there too is the potential release of methane as its own greenhouse gas that's rather potent to this. Is there any risk to releasing methane in shale gas?
Okay, so he's asking two questions, but the water also related to the shale gas?
Yeah, but
so the one question is about water, what are potential water impacts of any of these types of productions, and then for shale gas in particular, what about maybe potential methane release? Maybe Lynn would be a better person to ask about methane release. I think it would be kind of small, and methane is a very valuable gas, so they would do their utmost to capture it and use it. So typically that's okay, I think, compared to other sources of methane release. I never lost a sleepless night on that. Water is, with shale gas, is one of the big debates right now. So water is a huge concern for a lot of people, and this is because of this fracking. Now people are nervous that when you start fracking and then using, they call it wet hydrofracking, so they're actually doing this fracking using water or water with some other type of mixtures in it and pumping it in, very simplistically speaking, on a very, very high pressure, and then the rock will succumb to this pressure and fracture, right? That's a very simplistic way of looking at hydrofracking. And so they're afraid that this water that has stuff in it, or that could potentially get stuff in it from the reservoir through which it is going, may then either be released to we'll get into groundwater, or we'll get into other areas where you just don't want it, and it has environmental impacts that way. So a lot of my colleagues are working on this, and can we predict in advance, knowing a little bit about the geology of a shale gas reservoir, can we predict, first of all, how effective the hydrofracking would be, and second, where this water will go? And one of the big problems, of course, for policymakers and any type of organizations and people is that it is uncertain, these predictions. You don't really know that geology. A model has a lot of uncertainty in it and potential errors in the estimates. And so this is a risk analysis question. And when you make decisions, you have to weigh these risks. And that's really tricky. And there's typically what you see in politics also, and I talk to people about, is you have sort of two responses. One is that people try to put this in perspective, say, okay, well, the risk is about this high maybe. I'm willing to take that because these other activities also have associated risk, and I see this sort of the same. And there are people that are very, very risk averse and says, under no circumstances should we allow this. And then, of course, the people locally are much more worried about these things typically than the people remotely. That's always the case. So this immediately leads to local people and local NGOs and local policymakers versus people at a national level or companies. Very difficult to say. I think the debate is still out. Shale gas, there has so many uncertainties still also with the resource estimates, the reserve estimates, they keep changing. Yeah.
In the rapid expansion of shale gas extraction, government hasn't. There's criticism that government hasn't managed to put any kind of policies or any standards. They're always behind. Is it possible that maybe people on the ground who are extracting, they have more information than the government does, but somehow withholding it to?
Ooh, this is interesting conspiracy.
There's asymmetry of information on the ground.
Yeah, so he's asking, look, shale gassers, people have criticized Washington and also state politics for not having a framework in place, for a regulatory framework in place for shale gas extraction. And it always seems that politics runs behind this a little bit, and it's not really, it's interesting because of course politics doesn't like this either. They like to be much more proactive, and they try to be in some areas. And solar is one of those areas where they're actually trying to be proactive rather than reactive. But he's saying, could it be that the industry is withholding information that they just don't want to tell the policymakers? I don't know. No, there's certainly there's a lot of anxiety amongst people. There's very bad rap in a lot of these companies, and people don't trust them. Sometimes they're not completely forthright with information, but very often I actually think they are. Because it's also in their interest, and now of course you can say, oh, this Margot, she works with oil companies and gas companies, so she's positive about it. But I find that very often they understand it's in their best interest to be open about this. Because if they're not, it could really come back to haunt them. These investments are never done for the short term. Now, a big company does not invest billions and billions of dollars just for a couple of years investment, and then they're found out and they're shut down. They don't do this. They are in this for the long term, which is also a concern I have. You can promote shale gas, but shale gas is not going to be around for just 20 years. You build the infrastructure, be around for a long time. And so when you're making these very long-term investments, you do have to be a little careful. So they try also to play a little bit into politics. A couple of years ago, I noticed that a lot of these companies that I talked to were a little bit more nervous about this because they thought that just around the corner there were many, many new regulations and environmental regulations. Now maybe they feel less nervous about that with Congress having changed so much. That may change again. It's hard to say. On the whole, I think there's not a direct need to be extremely skeptical about what they say. A lot of the time we work directly with colleagues from these companies and trying to find out their solutions.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
With petroleum trading about 4 to 1 premium on a dollar per BTU equivalency to natural gas, do you see there being a switch to natural gas for transportation fuel? And what are the barriers to that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So basically what he's saying, gas is relatively, well, how would you?
Cheap.
Relatively cheap. Right now, right? Very low gas price. And so what, and it's much, in terms of the energy contents, it's much cheaper than oil. So this is a really interesting question. So why are we then not moving towards transport? In other countries, of course, they have done this. In Europe, Holland, where I'm from, in Germany with Angela Merkel, they have a lot more natural gas in their cars than we have for a long, long time. that was not really done from an economical incentive so much as it was for pollution standpoints, I think. So for the industry itself, the gas price is a concern. And not so much the fact that it's really low right now, but the fact it's very volatile. So this is another thing that really sets the two apart. I mean, oil prices go up and down, but gas is really quite unstable. And that is a big concern. And so I think that if we wanted to have a real big push towards gas fuel transport, if we wanted to do this instead of electric-based transport, we need a stabilization of the gas price. Most people think that gas is coupled to oil, but it's really not the case if you look at the two. And people worry about this, they're thinking about this, they're also thinking that the other way around, that if we replace a lot of coal with gas for electricity production, then the volumes of gas will go up, and then we have utility companies and other companies really all striving for the same thing, and that is gas price stabilization. So maybe we'll see this. Certainly people talk about it. But the way it is now, I think people find it a risky market.